These are 10 people who died inside a small cave in southern Poland roughly 18,000 years ago and whose bodies were taken apart with stone tools within hours of their death. This is the story of how their bones came out of the ground in 1883, waited in a museum for more than a century, and were read 3 completely different ways by 3 generations of scientists, with the most recent verdict arriving in February of 2025. Maszycka Cave opens onto the Maszycki Gorge inside Occulta National Park in Lesser Poland. Surveys give its length as either 33 or 35 meters, and the entrance perches about 65 meters above the valley floor below. During the Paleolithic, which is the period that concerns us, that entrance measured roughly 6 meters wide, 13 meters long, and 2.5 meters high. What it offered was shelter, a wall to put your back against, and a clear view of anyone climbing the slope toward you. People used it exactly that way. Evidence from the site points to a camp occupied between autumn and winter, and Polish records suggest the whole occupation may have lasted only 2 or 3 months inside a single year. Those campers belong to the Magdalenian, a late Ice Age culture that the University of Göttingen dates broadly to between 20,000 and 14,500 years ago. France supplies most of what we know about the Magdalenian, since this is the culture behind the Great Painted Caves, with Lascaux standing as its emblem. Technology recovered at Maszycka ties the site specifically to the Magdalenian, a navettes phase, which is associated with the French Magdalenian. That detail earns the first genuine surprise here. These were not local people who had always lived in the Prodnik Valley, which meant a Western European cultural signature had turned up in southern Poland. Gottfried Ossowski, an archaeologist and geologist, ran the first excavation in 1883, clearing the interior and part of the terrace across a total area of 60 square meters. Stefan Karol Kozłowski led a second campaign in the 1960s. Fieldwork returned one last time in 2013 when a team including Dariusz Bobak, Marta Potowicz Bobak, and Thomas Terberger recovered over 200 small flakes from Ossowski's own spoil heaps, along with more bone fragments and possible human remains. That fact alone tells you plenty about 19th century excavation, since what Ossowski discarded still held archaeology. 2 things among the finds deserve their own moment. Start with the bone and antler work because many of the recovered objects carry decoration. Most of them worked from reindeer antler, and that ornamentation counts as the oldest and among the very few traces of Paleolithic art known from Poland. Nobody should file this away as a marginal site. Measured by Ice Age art in Poland, Maszycka is the site. Then there is a Saiga antelope skull, covered in ochre, pulled from the cave entrance in the late 19th century. Dariusz Bobak, one of the co-authors of the 2025 study, has pointed out that red pigment carried ritual weight in essentially every early culture, and that its presence here suggests some kind of ritual attached to the place. Hold on to that skull, because it comes back before the end. Now we reach the human remains and the number that anchors this entire story. According to the 2025 study, the human assemblage currently consists of 63 specimens, 50 of which had already appeared in earlier publications. 42 of those 50 went back under the microscope, and the team then added 11 specimens that had never been published anywhere. Those 11 had not just come out of the ground. They were sitting in a box of faunal remains filed as animal bone, and for decades nobody had cataloged them as human. Working from those 63 specimens, the team calculated a minimum of 10 individuals, 6 adults and 4 juveniles. Specificity matters with the juveniles. 1 mandible and 1 scapula belonged to a child of roughly 6 years old, while 2 humeri with unfused distal epiphyses came from somebody between 10 and 16. Anatomically, the collection leans hard toward the head, since 69.8% of the identified assemblage consists of cranial and mandibular fragments against 30.2% postcranial. Trunk, hand, and foot bones barely register at 4 specimens, or 6.6% of everything recovered. 3 human specimens carrying cut marks and breakage went for direct radiocarbon dating. A mandible returned from 18,586 to 18,184 calibrated years before present, and a frontal bone landed close beside it. One right parietal came back considerably younger, at 15,754 to 15,357. A piece of housekeeping deserves attention here because it speaks to the quality of the work. One ulna in the collection dated to 5,748 BC, placing it in the Neolithic, thousands of years too young for this assemblage. Its appearance differed, with a more orange coloration and no evidence of human manipulation whatsoever, and the team excluded it along with a similar fibula fragment. Nobody quietly folded that outlier into the average. Cultural modifications turned up on 36 specimens, which works out to 67.9% of the assemblage. 31 of those carried straight, parallel, deep incisions with V-shaped cross-sections, the features that define cut marks. None of this reads as random damage because the pattern reads as a sequence. Across the parietal bones run groups of cuts parallel to the sagittal suture, and those are associated with scalping. Other cuts relate to defleshing and removal of the ears. Cuts on the mandible mark the defleshing of the jaw and its disarticulation from the skull, and then come notches and percussion pits along the cranial sutures, left when the skull was broken open to reach the brain. Below the head, every single shoulder girdle specimen shows butchery, meaning 1 scapula and 4 clavicles. Peeling appears on those bones, caused by bending them during disarticulation, while the femora, humeri, and a fibula carry defleshing marks, disarticulation marks, and percussion damage aimed at marrow. One first metacarpal shows carbonization across less than half its surface, which indicates direct exposure to fire. Confidence that these are tool marks rather than something else rests on a quantitative test. 53 modifications went into the analysis, 20 from Maszycka Cave, then 8 experimental cut marks, 12 experimental carnivore scores, and 13 experimental trampling marks drawn from the IPHES reference collection. High-resolution silicone molds captured the cross-sections, a confocal profilometer scanned them, and statistics did the comparing. The first 2 principal components accounted for 99.1% of the variance, with the Maszycka marks clustering alongside the experimental cut marks and separating cleanly from trampling and carnivore damage. One detail proves these authors were being straight with us. Of the 20 Maszycka modifications, 1 plotted near the carnivore group, and they reported it. 19 out of 20 makes a strong result, whereas 20 out of 20 would have looked suspicious. No carnivore modifications were identified overall, and no human tooth marks have been documented to date, which becomes the central point of contention. This is where the story stops being an excavation report and becomes a case study in how interpretation works. The first verdict came in 1995 when Zofia Kapicka and Andrzej Wiercinski studied 50 specimens, mostly cranial, and attributed them to 16 individuals, 8 adults and 8 children. Their conclusion pointed to an act of exocannibalism focused on the consumption of brains. Verdict 2 arrived in 2017 when Georg Orschit and colleagues re-examined the same sample and landed almost opposite. Their count dropped the minimum number of individuals to 9, and they reduced the substantiated cut marks to 5 specimens. Using 3D models, they confirmed that those marks were genuinely cultural in origin, made by people rather than by nature. Yet they read the whole assemblage as funerary behavior centered on skulls, ritual processing, not eating. Their reasoning held together and was specific. No human tooth marks existed, and the cultural modifications seemed too few. Verdict 3 landed in 2025, and the decisive move involved those 11 unpublished post-cranial bones, the ones filed in the animal box. Once arms and legs and shoulders enter the analysis, an argument for a skull-focused funerary rite becomes much harder to sustain, and the paper reports that no specific anatomical selection was identified with the bodies of adults and juveniles butchered for the same purposes. An elegant explanation follows for why the assemblage looks so skull-heavy to begin with. The anatomical representation may simply reflect the criteria of the earliest excavations, in which probably only specimens with obviously human characteristics were kept for study. Ossowski's team saved what looked like people, and everything else went in with the animals. Lead author Francesc Marginedes of the Catalan Institute of Human Paleoecology and Social Evolution summed it up by saying that the position and frequency of the marks, along with the targeted smashing of bone, leave no doubt that their intention was to extract nutritious components from the dead. Comparison carries the weight of that conclusion. Where cannibalism has been proposed, at other sites, rates of human modification exceed 30%, while non-consumptive, funerary contexts run between 1 and 5%, with bone breakage and tooth marks absent entirely. Maszycka Cave measures 67.9%. Gough's Cave in Somerset, England, the most famous Magdalenian cannibalism site, shows 65%, and Brillenhöhle in Germany shows 64%. Counting Maszycka, 17 Magdalenian assemblages currently show manipulation of human bodies related to butchering. Whatever unfolded in that cave, it was no isolated aberration. Here comes the hard part, where the evidence thins and the honest answer becomes that we do not know. Hunger looks unlikely to the researchers. Marta Poltowicz-Bobak of the University of Rzeszów points to the abundant animal bone at the site, game animals and mainly reindeer, and puts it plainly by saying that they had enough food, and it seems that cannibalism was not caused by hunger. Thomas Terberger of the University of Göttingen makes a wider version of that argument, since the sheer breadth of Magdalenian artistic output points toward favorable living conditions. Adding to that, the paper notes this period brought climatic improvement and population increase. Reverence gets ruled out on 2 grounds. Butchering happened shortly after death, with no period allowed for the body to decompose or dry, which is precisely what you would expect from secondary funerary treatment. More pointedly, the skull breakage at Maszycka does not follow the patterned sequence used at Gough's Cave to preserve the callot for a skull cup, and no evidence surfaced that any human bone here was worked into tools or objects. That absence carries weight, because Magdalenian groups are known to have used human bone as raw material for skull cups and jewelry. They knew the technique, and at Maszycka, they did not use it. Instead, the remains turned up mixed with settlement debris, treated, in Terberger's framing, without respect. Violence stands as the team's leading hypothesis. Marginatas has said that we know cannibalism was part of their culture, and he raises a possible warfare component in which the enemy is consumed as a symbolic act of dominance. The paper observes that the age profile at Maszycka resembles a complete nuclear family unit, and suggests these people could have been attacked, subdued, and cannibalized. Darius Bobak contributes 2 observations that fit. He argues this was likely a single event or several episodes across perhaps a few days, and he points to the abandoned tools, noting that bone tools took far longer to make than flint tools and held real value, so people did not simply walk away from collections of them. The fact that they did leave them behind suggests the inhabitants either died suddenly or fled. Any responsible account has to go past the press release. So here are the live problems. The missing tooth marks come first, and they were Orschiet's central objection back in 2017. Defense from the 2025 authors runs anatomical, since human tooth marks appear mainly on flat, fragile bones from the trunk, hands, and feet, which are exactly the elements making up only 6.6% of this assemblage. That answer holds together well, though it is not the same thing as positive evidence. The warfare hypothesis may simply be untestable. Silvia Bello, a paleoanthropologist at the Natural History Museum in London, who took no part in the study, told Science that she found it a very thorough paper and that, in her words, there is no doubt it is a case of cannibalism. Her caution begins with the warfare explanation, which she calls plausible, while saying that proving it is essentially impossible, because the bones were butchered so thoroughly that any signs of violence or injury have been obscured. The evidence that would settle the question was destroyed by the very process we are trying to explain. Most interesting of all, the victims may not have been strangers. Bello points out that genetic studies show the cannibalized Maszycka people shared ancestry with people buried in Magdalenian caves further west, which counts against the idea that they were locals killed by incoming colonizers. Related work from 2023 by Marsh and Bello links cannibalism across 8 Magdalenian assemblages to Goyet Q, to genetic ancestry, and primary burial to Villa Bruna ancestry, with the tentative suggestion that cannibalism may have been a common funerary tradition for Goyet Q2 associated populations. Sit with what that would mean. If the genetic evidence holds, then the framing of us against them may be wrong, and we may be looking at something a group did to its own. Now recall the Saiga skull at the entrance, covered in ochre. The authors themselves concede that separating endocannibalism, meaning consumption within a group, from exocannibalism presents a major challenge, because compassionate funerary cannibalism would leave much the same archaeological record as warfare cannibalism. Bones cannot tell us whether this was hatred or grief. 10 people then, 6 adults and 4 juveniles, one of them roughly 6 years old, 63 bone fragments, with 68% of them modified by human hands, butchered within hours of death, defleshed and disarticulated, their skulls opened for the brain, and their long bones smashed for marrow, then discarded among the debris of the camp beside the reindeer. All of that now stands about as firmly established as anything gets in Paleolithic archaeology. Why it happened remains unknown, and we may never close that gap. Notice what actually moved this case forward, because it wasn't a new dig, and technology alone did not do it either. Somebody opened a box labeled animal bones in a museum in Kraków, a box that had sat there for well over a century, and recognized 11 human specimens inside. Everything else followed from that single act of attention. Kapitsa and Wiercinski called it cannibalism in 1995. Orshit called it funerary ritual in 2017, reasoning from evidence that genuinely supported his reading of what was then available. Marginatas and colleagues called it cannibalism again in 2025, working with more material and better instruments. Carelessness explains none of those 3 positions, since each team reasoned correctly from an incomplete assemblage, and that assemblage was incomplete partly because of choices made by excavators in the 1880s who kept what obviously looked human and let the rest go. That is the real lesson of Maszycka Cave, and it reaches far beyond one small cave above the Pradnik Valley. The material record is not neutral because it has been filtered by every pair of hands that ever touched it. Re-examination is therefore no footnote to archaeology, since sometimes it turns out to be the entire discovery. The 2025 paper is open access, published in Scientific Reports, and you can read the whole thing for yourself.